Well, thank you for tuning into this demo on the FIRO suite of assessment products. I'm Robert Devine, and I'm a consultant with CPP, the publisher of Myers-Briggs and the FIRO assessment. I consult with organizations and individuals on management effectiveness, team building, career evaluation and management, executive selection, and some train-the-trainer initiatives. Today, I'll be providing you with a brief but comprehensive introduction to the FIRO assessment suite. So let's get into the FIRO products, and here's the material that I'd like to cover today. You can see I've got a list of things. I'd like to provide you with a brief overview and speak to some key applications and scenarios. These scenarios represent some of my favorite aspects of the FIRO experience. They are sources of client ahas I've found over the years, and I wanted to share a few of those with you. And I also wanted to give you some tips for getting started and for keeping informed about FIRO products, and that would be FIRO-B and the FIRO business material. So let's go on here to the FIRO assessment overview. And I promised on the earlier slide to give you some tips about getting started and keeping informed. Here's my first tip. I think it's best if you view and listen to this recorded session after you've had a chance to browse the CPP website. And that can be found at www.cpp.com. And look for the FIRO links. Look for FIRO-B and for FIRO business. And I think it's best if you view and examine some of the downloadable reports that you can get from the CPP website. You'll see a number of them there for John Sample and Jane Sample. And if you've had a chance to look through some of those things, I think this session will make way more sense to you. So let's go on first to the assessment overview. So FIRO was created by a man named Will Schutz, and he started his work on FIRO in the mid-1950s. And these are his objectives and purposes from his original FIRO technical guide. As you can see, FIRO attempts to predict who's going to get along with whom and who's not going to get along with whom. Now, Schutz's wording is a little bit academic, but basically he was trying to help people identify who's going to click and who's going to clash and over what. That's an interesting beginning to his assessment. Over the years, as you can see from this slide, some aspects of FIRO and its purposes have been adjusted and reworded. You can see that one of the aspects of FIRO is it attempts to gauge the level of satisfaction that people derive from being with people. At its heart, FIRO seeks to help people self-assess and to self-regulate, and then to use this understanding of self and others to manage relations. Now, FIRO-B is based on what Schutz referred to as social needs theory. And I had a conversation with Will about this some years back, and he took me back to my first experiences with science in about the 3rd or 4th grade. And he gave me an example of one of those first experiments that we all did as kids in the classroom with a clear plastic cup with a wet paper towel in it, and all of us were given a mung bean that we inserted into the cup between the wet paper towel and the outside of the cup so that you could see the bean. And we were all amazed as we'd see our beans start to sprout and grow. We were amazed that it apparently didn't matter which way you put the bean in. It figured out which end the root needed to come out of and which end the stem needed to come out of. And we used this little experiment for all kinds of activities, for graphing and math and science. One of the things that I remember doing was once we all had some leaves, we all noticed that our leaves for our plants were oriented out of the classroom window towards the sun. And on a Friday afternoon, just before we left to go home, we were all instructed to turn our cups with our beans in there so that the leaves are oriented into the darkened classroom. And we left them that way on the Friday afternoon. And lo and behold, when we came back to school on the Monday morning, the leaves had all magically reoriented themselves back to the sun. And Schutz makes the point that all organisms on Earth have some basic needs. In the case of those beans, they have needs for light, for some heat, water, perhaps some nutrients, and that if those plants get too much or too little of those things that it needs, it stresses the organism. And Schutz says that the same thing is true about us as humans, except we also have needs besides sustenance and warmth and protection and so forth. We also have some social needs. And Schutz refers to them, you can see it here on this slide, he refers to them as inclusion, control, and affection. These three need areas have been also reframed to involvement, influence, and connection for the FIRO business reports. So Schutz says that if we as individuals get our needs for inclusion, control, and affection met at the levels that we are comfortable with, then we will have a state of equilibrium. If we get too much of the things that we want, it can stress us. If we get too little of the things that we want, it will stress us. And so he says that as we go through our lives, one of the intrigues of daily living is that each one of us is going about getting their needs met at the level that they are comfortable with, and that in so doing, we may or may not be meeting the needs of others. So this is the basis of FIRO. You can see the last two bullets on this slide indicate the FIRO scales. I've already named them for you. For FIRO-B, it's inclusion, control, and affection. And for the more recent FIRO business, those have been renamed to involvement, influence, and connection. And each one of these three needs are assessed in two dimensions. That is the expressed dimension. That is, how much do we send signals about these needs to others? And also the wanted dimension. That is, how comfortable are we when others initiate that kind of behavior back to us? So this is the basis of FIRO theory. And this translates into a report page for a FIRO-B profile that looks like this. We refer to this as our FIRO grid. It contains some scale scores. You can see the three areas for inclusion, control, and affection, both expressed and wanted, in the upper left-hand corner of this grid. And you can see some totals running across the bottom and down the right-hand side. So as I said, this is our FIRO grid from the FIRO-B profile report. And you can see, I think you can make this out, that this is for Jane's sample. This would be for the sample that you can download from CPP's website. And I wanted to just kind of take you through these FIRO-B scales and make some proposals, some interpretive proposals for what these scores might mean. So first, let's take a look at our need for expressed inclusion for Jane. You can see that, that inclusion, as you read some of the definitions there, inclusion is about participation and distinction and recognition. And Jane's score for expressed inclusion is pretty high. It scores at about a 7. Now the possible range of scores is 0 to 9 for this. So Jane getting a score of 7 would be would indicate that her scores were pretty high. She has a strong need to send signals to others that she wants to include them. She's frequent and consistent about sending those signals too. She wants to include them, she wants to be with them, identify with them, and connect. Jane, from these scores, we could propose is likely a pretty good networker. She wants people to come together and to work together. Now, if we continue on with the rest of Jane's inclusion scores, I'll just highlight those for you. You can see that we've got expressed inclusion, and in the second row down, there's a wanted inclusion. That's that second dimension. And you can see that this is the degree to which Jane is comfortable receiving inclusion attempts from others. And you can note it also is high with a score of 7. So we could surmise that Jane likes to be invited. She likes to be approached and asked to join in and to share information. We could even go so far as to suggest with these scores that Jane is likely a pretty cooperative and collaborative person. And you can see down the bottom that her total inclusion scores, that is 7 plus 7, equals 14. And the range of scores there, you can see at the very bottom of the column, is from 0 to 18. So with a score of 14, we say, wow, they're pretty strong scores. And we could say that she's likely an active, energetic person. She's enthusiastic. Even go so far as to predict that on the Myers-Briggs that she'd likely have extroverted preferences, and that people in general would be a constant source of interest and satisfaction for Jane. She likely has lots of acquaintances. She needs to be with people. So these are some of the proposals that we could make for Jane's high needs for sending inclusion signals and receiving signals of inclusion from others. Well, now let's go on to the next need area, and in this case it's control. And you can see I've put a highlight around the expressed control score for Jane. Now remember that control is about influence and about goals and goal focus, responsibility, and about direction, giving it and receiving it. You can see that Jane's expressed control is pretty low. Her score here is just 1 out of a possible score of 9, suggesting that Jane can be uncomfortable if she's required to provide direction, decisions, or maybe even to impose structure to others and on others. She more likely values her freedom, and she's uncomfortable taking responsibility for the actions of others. She would, you can see her wanted scores here as we move on. I'll highlight the whole column for control. Her wanted control scores are high as you can go, in fact. She's very comfortable when other people in authority give her direction. And so she would be much more comfortable receiving structure and control from others than sending it to others. And now let's move on to the third need area. It's for affection. And you can see that, again, it's the same range of scores, of 0 to 9. And affection is about one-on-one relationships. It's about closeness and openness and warmth and loyalty. And again, here you can see that Jane's expressed affection score is high. It's a 7. So she frequently sends information and messages to others that she values disclosure. She has high interest in getting people to know her and to relate to her. Now let's put a highlight around the whole affection so you can kind of see it as a whole need area. Notice as we move down the column, Jane's wanted affection score is also high. So she's comfortable when others relate to her in sort of in kind. Just the way she sends signals to others, she wants them to send them back to her. She likes it when people are open and warm and loyal and responsive to her. We could even go so far as we add both up and see it too as a score of 14, just like her inclusion score. She likely has many close friends, and she can be counted upon to give and receive compliments, assurance, coaching, and counsel. We could say about Jane that she's likely loyal and supportive. So now, let's take another look at this grid, looking just at the totals down the bottom of the grid. You can see that I've highlighted the total inclusion, total control, and the total affection scores. We always take a look to see which one's highest and which one's lowest. In this case, we have a tie. Inclusion and affection both come in at 14. Control comes in with a score of 10. So FIRO theory suggests that Jane would emphasize people and relationships, perhaps more so than she would emphasize tasks and goals. She will help create and maintain a work environment that features perhaps fast pace, energy, enthusiasm from the inclusion scores, and also loyalty and cooperation from those affection scores. And she'll be less comfortable if she has to confront, or to challenge, or to sell her plan for what needs to be done. She's a team player who's much more comfortable following the directions set down by others and by the team in the organization. Now, the last thing I wanted to look at on the FIRO-B grid for Jane is the score in the bottom right-hand corner. We don't have time really to run through all of the totals. You can get all of this kind of thing from the support materials for FIRO-B, but I just wanted to call out to you that Jane's overall need score, that is the total of all of her 6 scales for expressed inclusion, control, and affection, and wanted inclusion, control, and affection, her overall need score is medium to high with a score of 38. And remember that the highest possible would have been 54. And there are various interpretive guides around the FIRO material that propose that a score such as this would suggest that Jane is outgoing, active, and as I mentioned before, likely extrovert. And you can kind of see each one, the final bullet off to the right of the grid, suggests that each one of the scores has interpretive meaning. And as I mentioned, all of these things are spelled out in the resource guides that go along with FIRO-B. Let's go on and take a very quick look at the history of FIRO. You can see that work was begun on this thing by Will Schutz back in the early 50s, around the Korean War, actually. And he did it on behalf of the U.S. Navy. The Navy wanted to know if it was possible for them to predict who would work well together and who might not be so productive when they came together. And so he developed FIRO-B in order to answer that question. You can see that CPP got FIRO-B in the late 70s and have been continually refining it ever since. You can see some of the support materials of their publication dates as they came out. You can see a book that we'll be looking at pretty soon, a couple of the activities. For year 2000, the Participating in Teams booklet by Gino Schnell. And that's when Alan Hammer also did a FIRO-B technical guide. And you can see most recently in 2009, 2010, the FIRO Business Assessments came out. And FIRO Business was a real step forward, I think, for FIRO-B. Made it even more friendly and usable. Here you can see that for FIRO-B, the 54 items on FIRO-B were reduced to just 30 items for the FIRO Business products. There is much less repetition in the items. It was one of the complaints that we heard from some users. The scoring method was replaced to more familiar Likert-type scales. I mentioned earlier that the scales names have even been renamed from inclusion, now involvement, control, which has a sense of big brother and big sister to it, has been changed to influence. And affection, of course, which is perhaps one of the most problematic in terms of the name for the scale, has been renamed to connection. They get to the same underlying psychological principles, but I think that they are much more user-friendly and coach-friendly names. You can see from the second last bullet about the scoring sample that considerable work has been done on renorming the instrument for FIRO Business. It's now available in different languages. There are different norm groups available by language. And you can also see that FIRO Business moves from raw scores to using percentiles. And our clients, the customers, tell us this is much more useful in organizational settings.